By now, George Soros is becoming a meme on the internet. Whenever someone name drops George Soros, usually people just tune out and they stop listening. The reason for this being that a lot of people on the right have levied unfounded accusations against him. And there is some objective truth to why they do this. You see, George Soros, through his NGO, the Open Society Foundation, has supported and funded a lot of left-leaning think tanks and left-leaning activist groups, such as groups advocating for open borders, groups that use as much as they can identity politics in order to further their gains, groups that have supported unaccountable international organizations against democracies. And because of this, usually people assume that George Soros is behind all of these things. But in reality, there are other institutions that also operate in a similar manner. Some institution coming from Sweden or Norway, and they're also pumping money into similar activities. So when someone from the right says, well, this is funded by George Soros, what ends up happening is that once in a blue moon, he is wrong, and it's actually funded by another organization. And then the people on the left can go, it's like, oh, look, see, these people see George Soros behind every shadow. These people are peddling into conspiracy theories. This had nothing to do with George Soros. And because of this, they try to debunk every single accusation. But it's not true, because once in a while, the man himself, the Soros, is posting thought pieces and opinions on the internet regarding important events. And these thought pieces serve in order to train journalists into the correct way of thought. Like you're going to see what is being written here on the 10th of December, starting to pop up in various publications across Europe. Local newspapers, and even maybe certain newspapers with more prestige like the BBC, are going to echo the exact thoughts that George Soros has them here. So this is the purpose of this article. It's not something for the people to read, it's something for the journalists and the thought leaders to read. So before we start, let's explain to our American friends what this is all about. You see, the European Union has been using rule of law as a beating stick in order to get other nations, especially Eastern European nations, to fall in line. The problem with this is that the rule of law sounds really good when spoken out. Most people will agree with it. However, if you ask someone to define what rule of law actually means, they will have a very difficult time because, well, it means whatever Germany or the European Union at the time wants it to mean. It's very similar to the same way hate speech works. On paper, most people agree that incitement to violence is a bad thing. But then when you see how hate speech is applied, you will notice that even South Park episodes, jokes, humor fall under the same category of hate speech, and as such, they need to be banned and removed. And most of the time, it seems that hate speech just are things that upset the ruling class rather than upset the actual people on the ground that it's supposed to protect. And it's the same with the rule of law. So the rule of law technically tries to fight against corruption. And it's just interesting to see how the corruption always happens to be in Eastern Europe. It never happens to be in Germany. It never happens to be in France. And heaven forbid, it never happens to be in the European Union. And this isn't because there is no corruption in these places. And it has more to do with the fact that the people exposing this corruption, especially the one from the European Union, have very bad things happen to their professional life and usually are completely ignored by the mainstream media. I will attach into the pinned comment a documentary so you can just see what happens to one of these whistleblowers that talk about the corruption that takes place at the highest level of the European Union. But for some reason, people like George Soros do not seem to be concerned whatsoever when the corruption happens in the European Union. People like George Soros do not advocate for international committees to investigate the level of corruption from Germany and France. Usually these committees are always concerned about the corruption that happens in Eastern Europe, in countries like Poland or Hungary. Furthermore, what's more interesting is that when a government from Eastern Europe plays ball with the European Union sends only praise and good things about that particular government. But when a government refuses to play ball, all of a sudden that government happens to be very corrupt, and the European Union is very concerned about the rule of law being applied in Eastern Europe. A perfect example with this would be the Romanian Democratic Liberal Party, which was governed by Traian Băsescu. When this man was in charge, all of a sudden the European Union was congratulating Romania for its massive leaps and massive steps in order to deal with corruption and establish rule of law. Now, after the Democratic Liberals are no longer in power and the regime is over, most of the ministers that Traian Băsescu had under his government are in prison for corruption. And yet, no one in the press seems to have a problem with this. Why was the European Union at the time cheating this regime, and now they don't at least apologize for having egg on their face? Because the reality is that this has nothing to do with corruption. And I want to stress out so that people understand that I'm not claiming that Eastern European politicians are not corrupt. They most certainly are. In fact, I would make the argument that the overwhelming majority of them are corrupt. The only problem is that the European Union has no issues working with corrupt politicians as long as they push forward the European Union's agenda. The moment they don't play ball, that's when they start caring about corruption. It's very similar to how the terms of service are being applied on social media. If you happen to align yourself with the ideological values of whatever corporation you're using the website from, then you can have more leniency in breaking the terms of service. If you happen to go against the ideological values of the corporation, then even the smallest things that you can do are going to be put under a microscope. So with that introduction out of the way, let's see what the favorite philanthropist George Soros is saying. He is saying that Merkel has surrendered to Hungarian and Polish extortion. Now, I would like people to notice how he doesn't even talk about the European Union, because it's an open secret that the European Union is not a democratic institution. It was never meant to be. It is an institution that is de facto governed by Germany and France, and more specifically, Germany. And in this case, Germany being a very democratic nation, which has Angela Merkel chancellor for the last 15 years. You see, the laws in Germany do not give much power to the president. Instead, they empower the chancellor, which can be elected for as many times the ruling party manages to get a majority in the elections. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but suffice to say that Germany and other people always look towards Russia and complain that Putin has been in power for so long, but no one complains about the fact that the German chancellor has been in power for more than 15 years. The European Union is facing an existential threat, George Soros says. And yet the European Union's leadership is responding with a compromise that appears to reflect a belief that the threat can simply be wished away. So, yet again, notice how when member states of the European Union are looking out for their best interests, the European Union just happens to face an existential threat. To make a comparison, imagine if in the United States, Texas would manage to get a win and passing some legislation, and then you would hear some thinkers that, oh, the republic is under threat because Texas is having a say in how the country is being run. Soros continues to say that Prime Minister Viktor Orban kleptocratic regime in Hungary, and to a lesser extent the liberal law and justice government in Poland, are brazenly challenging the values on which the European Union has been built. This is absolutely false. Both Poland and Hungary are using the values and the legislation capabilities provided to them to operate within the European Union. It is completely legal for them to veto any piece of legislation that they consider to go against their country's values. Furthermore, I noticed this trend that a lot of journalists here in my country as well as abroad are constantly saying that Hungary is an evil regime. It's an evil dictatorship that needs to go away in order for us to have the benevolent dictatorship of Angela Merkel and the European Union. In reality, if you look at the happiness of the people in Hungary, you will notice that it's one of the top 3 countries in the world where the happiness of the population has been under a consistent rise. And yet, we are to understand that if the Hungarian people are happy, then they need to get rid of their leadership. I recognize and understand the enormous pressure under which Chancellor Angela Merkel has been laboring. She has been Germany's chancellor for 50 years and is now approaching retirement. With French President Emmanuel Macron temporarily distracted by the La Cité issue and other security concerns within France, Merkel has become something of the sole main decision maker for the European Union. I think the jokes speak for themselves. I don't even need to continue making any commentary regarding this. George Soros continues to say that he understands why the German Chancellor does not want another country, in this case Hungary, to announce its intentions to leave the European Union on her watch. That is reportedly what Orban was preparing to do. I highly doubt that this is the case, by the way. I haven't heard Viktor Orban make such a statement, which would have been massive enough in order to go throughout the entire press. But again, if you repeat a lie long enough, people are eventually going to believe it. Orban has stolen and misappropriated vast sums of funds during decades in power, including European Union funds that should have gone to benefit the Hungarian people. He cannot afford to have a practical limit imposed on his personal and political corruption, because these illicit procedures are the grease that keeps the wheels of the regime turning smoothly. I think that this might be true, but I strongly doubt that this is the actual reason why George Soros doesn't like Orban. I think he's just concern trolling. It's clear that the people of Hungary like Orban because why else would they vote for him? Why else are their happiness as a population constantly rising? The main problem with Viktor Orban is that he is a nationalist. He puts the interest of the nation state above that of an international unaccountable organization. And here lies the problem, because the European Union wants more sovereignty from the nation states, while Viktor Orban doesn't want to play ball. Another issue that they're having is that Viktor Orban has decided to cut access from the taxpayer money to George Soros's NGOs, as well as to a lot of leftist think tanks and indoctrination machines that try to pollute the mind of the Hungarian people. This is Viktor Orban saying, not mine. And because of this, they are outraged. How dare the Hungarian taxpayer money not pay for George Soros's gender studies at the university in order to cause for more student debt and other type of woes and hardships. But this is not a winning statement. This is not how you get the people on your side. It sounds a lot better if you just say, oh, well, they're corrupt, they're stealing money. Oh, that's why. That's the only reason that they don't want to approve the COVID relief fund given out of the charity and compassion of Angela Merkel, which in reality is not even her money. It's taxpayer money that also Hungary contributes to, and they have a right to veto. But threatening to torpedo the EU's finances by voting its budget was a desperate gamble on Orban's part, but it was a bluff that should have been called. Unfortunately, Merkel, it appears, caved in to Hungarian and Polish extortion. It's a very colorful framing here. As I write, it seems clear that Merkel has broken a compromise with Orban and Poland's de facto leader. Deputy Prime Minister Jarosław Kaczyński, the deal that Germany made with the EU's two rogue member states, however, constitutes the worst of all possible worlds. The widely leaked text of the proposed compromise to be embedded in the concluding state has transpired here. The European Union talks about giving a COVID relief fund to nation states. However, they're saying we're only going to allow this money if you're going to subject yourself to our fact checkers to see if you're following rule of law or not. To which Poland and Hungary said, no, we're going to veto that. We don't need your money if you're going to interfere and meddle into our internal affairs. Our nations need to have sovereignty. And because of this, apparently Poland and Hungary are now rogue member states, And the fact that they do not want the control of Brussels over their internal affairs is the worst thing that has ever happened. Which, in my opinion, it just opened the way to the dialogue, it opened the way to negotiations, and it's how democracy should actually function. Democracy isn't something where an institution gets whatever it wants all the time. Democracy is built on negotiating. It's built on two parties coming together in order to find common ground. Something that old man Soros doesn't seem to appreciate in the slightest. And here we have the George Soros master plan, which is exactly why most people on the right dislike this philanthropist and people that think like him. The declaration alters in substance and intent the text of the regulation that was agreed by the EU institutions on November the 5th, weakening the rule of law condition considerably. Neither the European Commission nor the European Parliament, let alone the national governments that made the integrity of the regulation their main concern in the European Council, should allow themselves to be elbowed aside this way. Second, some provisions in the deal served the delay of the implementation of the rule of law by up to 2 years. That would be a true cup for Orban, as it would delay any possible action until after the next scheduled Hungarian parliamentary election in 2022. The reprieve would give Orban party ample time to change Hungarian laws and constitutional provisions and allow Orban to continue redefining what constitutes public funds in Hungary in ways that enable for him to channel ill-gotten loot from public bodies into private foundations controlled by his cronies. So, in other words, to translate, what people like George Soros want to do is to find whatever process they can, whatever political machination they can, in order to bypass the will of the people. If people want Orban to win elections, but because he is under investigation and he has been suspended and therefore cannot run for the elections, well, it just so happens that he's not being re-elected. And the main issue is that it's not okay for Orban to have ill-gotten loot from public funds into his private foundations, because it starves George Soros' foundations from the ill-gotten loot from public funds. But anyway, this is the video for today. Let me know what you think. It's a new setup that I'm using. I'm using new audio. Hopefully there hasn't been any clipping or any distortions or anything like that. Let me know if you like it, and I'll be seeing you guys in the comment sections. Take care.